Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the NLA's annual Active Travel Summit. I'm Peter Murray, I'm Curator-in-Chief at NLA and Chair for today. So we've got some great speakers hearing their reflections on the impact of the pandemic on the active travel agenda in London, looking towards a more pedestrian-focused city of the future, particularly, of course, under the new hierarchy of road users, which will be in the revised highway code with luck. And this event is part of the Transport Infrastructure Programme of the NLA, and I'm very pleased to thank our programme champions, Network Rail. And I just remind you that there will be a chance to ask our speakers questions at the end, and so you can do that through the Q&A button on your screen. But first, I'm very delighted to announce the winners for a competition for light segregation, which was organised by the Construction Industry Cycling Commission as a part of the London Festival of Architecture. And this looks at way we can deliver light segregation to protect cyclists and to create safer cycling. And I'm very like to start by thanking our judges. I was very pleased to have David Byrne of Talking Heads and author of Bicycle Diaries, TV presenter and cyclist Jeremy Vine, Walking and Cycling Commissioner Will Norman, London's Bicycle Mayor Lucy Mahoney, Councillor Clyde Lokes of Waltham Forest, Sophie Thompson of LDA Design, and Susan Claris of Arup, Brian Deegan of Urban Movement, Anthony Lau, Cycle Hoop. They were our judges and they did an excellent job in choosing, I think, some really interesting schemes. I'm very grateful to Susan Claris, particularly for chairing the judges. And we'll just start off with some words from those judges. And Molly, if you could just play that little video, please.
Over the last year, we've rolled out over 100 kilometres of new cycle routes in London at an astonishing pace. And the result of that, hundreds of thousands more people are cycling. Kids are cycling on main roads where they wouldn't dream of it before. However, it's so important that we've got such a beautiful city. Let's make the future of these cycle lanes as beautiful as the city in which they sit. And so I would like to thank everybody with all their creativity, the energy, the ideas. I think as a panel of judges, we've seen merit in every single one of these, and all credit to everybody who's taken part. And thank you also to all the judges.
What's really great is that everyone now, there's so much passion out there for making cycling safer, but also people have considered other things which we're all dealing with right now in terms of the climate emergency and thinking about how we integrate kind of multi-benefits in terms of reducing stormwater, introducing biodiversity and planting in relation to climate, etc. So, it's great, and it's good to see how the different solutions sort of try and marry form, function and beauty, which is fantastic.
I think some of these concepts and designs have really expanded our thinking on the use of sustainable materials, bringing in sustainable urban drainage systems and greening, and then also a little bit on how we can also involve the community in this, which is so important going forwards.
This is really encouraging to see all these designs and to see the concern and kind of the energy going into this. When I talk to friends who hesitate to ride bicycles in the city, their main concern is safety. They feel like, oh, what if a car pulls over into the bike lane or any of that kind of stuff. And that this is addressing this is very encouraging.
I can't thank you enough for showing me everything that you did to suggest different ways of marking off these vital spaces for people on bicycles. Honestly, seeing the winner's entry made real will be the most personal statement to cyclists. We care for you, we want you to stay safe, and we care about the city and the way it looks too. It's not just about getting there, it's about enjoying the way there. Thank you.
Right,
over the last
let's
year,
see who the winners are. If we can go to the PowerPoint, here we are. So onto the first slide, please, Molly. So first, special mention is Bamboo by McCoy and Muchamois. And next slide, please. Their project was not fully worked out, but the judges thought that the idea of using bamboo in the various ways suggested was so interesting that it was well worth giving them a bit of funding and also helping them to develop this further. Next. And now we had two winners. The first winner is Blooming London by Pitman Tozer Architects. Next slide, please, Molly. And this is a project which uses a very elegant idea of using flowers to delineate the cycle route, and also using local communities to help develop the projects. This is something which was inspired by the poppies, which were at the in the Tower of London, which is a great cultural and artistic installation. And this brings flowers onto the streets, but also creates very safe spaces for cyclists. And here's an illustration of that in situ. Next slide. Thank you very much, and congratulations to Pitman Tozer. And the second winner is, next slide please, Slow the Flow by Xanthi Quayle. Next slide. And this is a very interesting project which integrates sustainable urban drainage with the potential for planting, but also eases the runoff from cycle routes into the drainage system, which is an important part of dealing with the increase in flash flooding that we're seeing across London at the moment. And this is a very sustainable concept. Now, all three will be advised by Cycle Hoop about how they can get their projects manufactured, how we can actually start getting them to market, and to help them actually be put into the streets. And I hope our first speaker might also be able to help in that regard. But I'd like to say thank you very much for everyone who entered the competition. We will be putting up the entries onto the Construction Industry Cycling Commission website later today, and you'll be able to see them there. And we will be looking to ensure that, as Jeremy Vine says, that we get these onto the streets and make cycling safer for everybody. So thank you everybody who entered the competition. Thank you to our judges, and congratulations to the winners. So now let's kick off with the rest of today's presentations, and we're going to hear first from Will Bradley, who is the Principal Policy Officer at the GLA. Will, over to you.
Thank you, Peter, and wonderful to see those winners, and hopefully this time next year we might have some slides at this conference of some of those on street. So there's my challenge. Yeah, as Peter said, my name's Will Bradley. I work at the GLA. I work in Will Norman's team. We've just heard from him briefly. He is having an extremely well-earned break. He has switched his phone off, and we're under strict instructions to not contact him unless it's extremely serious. So, so you're hearing from me, and looking forward to hearing from some other great colleagues who have kind of shared this roller coaster 16 months that we've all been through. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So how we use our streets and the changes we've been making to our streets since the start of the pandemic was very much front and centre of the debate during the recent election campaign where Sadiq was re-elected. You can see here, you know, these ones that we've already been talking about were prominent, you know, both as part of the debate, but actually in the manifesto. And this kind of really reflects, as I said, the kind of the whirlwind 16 months that we have had. Now, if you can think back this far, I mean, it feels maybe like a decade ago, but March 2020, TfL was starting to tell Londoners not to use public transport, going against absolutely everything, the whole raison d'etre of this organisation. It was a very, very strange position to be in. We had to also start moving quickly to ensure that our city kind of worked for this kind of new reality that we were in. Not initially necessarily for people to be able to get around safely, but just literally to be able to stand on a pavement safely. Next slide, please. As is often the case, it wasn't actually local authorities or TfL or the mayor who moved first, but it was, you know, some wonderful people from in civil society. This is something that a great group of young female urbanists, the tactical urbanistas, they went out on street and they started creating wider pavements. If you remember back to, you know, that strange time in March, April, you know, there were older people, you know, more vulnerable people kind of still having to go to the bank, still having to go to a post office, still having to go to get their food from a supermarket, and sort of crowding on some of London's very narrow pavements and footways. So the kind of first change that started to happen, first by kind of guerrilla groups like this, but also then TfL started to make some changes. Next slide, please. And so this is down in Brixton, you know, a very busy 6 lanes of traffic, not much pavement space. And it was becoming very uncomfortable. You can see there's a bank there. You know, it was clear that there just wasn't enough space for people to kind of exist in the city at a certain point with this kind of new reality of having to keep away from everyone. Next slide, please. So we started to create more space to, you know, repurpose some of the large amounts of carriageway space that you have down in Brixton. We took out a lane of traffic overnight, put down a rubber curb, you know, filled in the space with some tarmac, and hey presto, you've kind of doubled the space for pedestrians, and suddenly you have a much more kind of comfortable space where people can social distance. Over time, we managed to repurpose about 22,000 square meters of carriageway space. You know, this is one of the kind of themes that I kind of want to draw out, which is really both the kind of the speed at which we were able to operate when everyone was kind of aligned. You know, this might have taken a year to plan and deliver in normal times, but this actually just kind of happened overnight. Next slide, please. It was only really as we kind of started to think about opening up again that the street space program kind of started to take shape. So it wasn't just that we needed to give people space for social distancing on pavements, but we also needed to think about how people would get around differently, given that you know, the capacity on public transport was going to stay pretty low for some time with social distancing in place. And we'd seen from cities at different stages of the pandemic, particularly in China, that as their economies were opening up, there was a massive spike in car use. And, you know, congestion, as everyone knows, in London, and air pollution has always been a problem. We've been making good strides on that, but to deal with those issues, we had to see car use going down. So any rise in car use would cause serious problems. So we started to think quickly about how we could enable people to get around in different ways, particularly on bikes. So this was until last year a kind of old unsegregated cycle superhighway, not somewhere that an unconfident cyclist would particularly want to be. You can see coaches there. Next slide, please. So we moved quickly, again, using these wands that we've talked about so much. And again, overnight, routes like this got an upgrade. So just before COVID hit, we'd announced that we tripled the amount of protected space for cycling over the mayor's first term. And a year later, this was more like 5 times. And as Will Norman alluded to in that video, 100 kilometers, just over 100 kilometers and counting of new space for cycling has been built in the last 16 months. And that's a 150% increase in our pace of delivery. Next slide, please. It's not all ones. We have been able to keep moving with the kind of construction of some of our permanent routes. This is Cycleway 4, almost finished, frustratingly still got some barriers left on there. I'll have to talk to Nina about that a bit later, but that is coming on nicely. Next slide, please. And also down in Tower Hamlets, a recently finished scheme. This is a borough that haven't necessarily taken the kind of street space way of working, but they kind of continue to deliver really high quality schemes that are enabling people to kind of get around in different ways. Next slide, please. And another one that's recently finished is in Islington. It's just kind of showing you what this kind of space enables. You know, that's, you know, a mum and a daughter and a dog kind of pootling along with, you know, totally protected from traffic, and, you know, it making a journey that might otherwise have been in a polluting vehicle. Next slide, please. And we've seen a cycling boom. So Santander Cycles is the only TfL service that's operating with greater numbers than before the pandemic. You know, whilst traffic has been faster to recover than public transport, traffic is still slightly down overall. Tube use is still under 50%, bus use is still under 70%, but Santander is, you know, it does fluctuate a little bit with the rain, which we've been seeing a lot of recently, but it's consistently above 100% compared to the kind of pre-pandemic figures. And that is, you know, quite remarkable when we know, you know, lots of us are still working at home. We are all doing this conference at home. And, you know, we have seen kind of particularly large increases at weekends, so much that, you know, our data people are having to kind of go back and check the numbers because they were thinking that more than 200% was just couldn't be right, but it really is. And anyone who's kind of been out on a kind of sunny weekend recently will just see how many people there are cycling around town. Next slide, please. Just some more figures here and some more routes. This is Pancras Way, where cycling's up 115%. Next slide, please. Croydon High Street up 109%. Next slide, please. And so alongside, you know, our kind of growing cycling network, there has also been the matter of more than 100 low traffic neighbourhoods, a topic that has generated possibly more column inches than we would have liked. I probably don't need to explain what a low traffic neighbourhood is to people on here, and Rachel will take us through that in a bit more detail. But essentially, it's another tool that we have, you know, a long-standing tool to make active travel easier and safer. It's about reducing traffic on minor roads, taking out through traffic, keeping through traffic on main roads, and turning these minor roads into spaces which are suitable, as you can see here, for kids to kind of pootle about on. And again, the kind of the strategic placement of a planter, it's very cheap, it's very quick, it can go in overnight, and that causes its own problems. But what it did mean was that we could move very fast to kind of totally kind of repurpose what our streets look like and how they're used. Next slide, please. So as you can see here, you know, we're talking about transport and getting around and movement, but really what's most exciting about low traffic neighborhoods is what they do for place. You know, it's about, this is down in Dulwich. You can see that there's this is on a quiet way, it's on a strategic cycle route, but it also, these changes enable you to create public space. And where you create good public space, in the words of Jan Gell, public life can then flourish. And as you can see here, you know, a couple of benches outside a bookshop, and you've got somewhere to kind of hang out, make a phone call, meet your friends when you don't want to go inside. Next slide, please. And this is what that route used to look like. It was pretty unpleasant, you know, rat running vans, not a place that you would really want to cycle, let alone sit and read a book. Next slide, please. Cycling levels in this low traffic neighbourhood up by 74%, net reduction in traffic of 15%, so that's 23,000 less vehicles, including on the boundary roads. We've seen over 100 low traffic neighbourhoods go in. Some of those have come out. Just less than 20, I think, is the current count. So we've still got over 80 in place, which, you know, is quite a remarkable achievement. And again, you know, there has been, you know, a huge amount of debate about this. The politics are very difficult, but we're starting to see really good data coming through. And Rachel will go into this in a bit more detail. But, you know, not only are we seeing, you know, traffic going down, pollution going down, but we're also seeing, you know, cycling up, walking up, and really, really encouraging data around road danger as well, which Rachel, I'm sure, will talk about. Next slide, please. And another kind of theme that I want to draw out here is just what this has enabled in terms of kind of experimentation. You know, big authorities aren't known for taking risks and experimenting with how we use our streets, but the pandemic has kind of forced us to do this and really enabled this. So you can see down here, this is a low traffic neighborhood in Southwark, a few kind of old oil bins, and then, you know, some ideas about how this space could look. Next slide, please. So what it enables is, you know, that for apologies, my cat has just jumped up on my shoulder. But yeah, you know, as I said, you know, we've now got proposals like this for how we can, you know, really think very differently about what our streets look like and what they're used for. Next slide, please. You know, so a street like this, and next slide, you know, could end up looking like this. And it's another thing that has kind of really changed, certainly in the time that I've been working on this topic, is around the kind of the quality of placemaking by highways engineers. And I think, you know, Peter, we've had many meetings, you know, with developers together, where, you know, developers are often very critical of TfL for its kind of quality of placemaking, saying, well, you know about how to manage traffic, and we know about placemaking. And I think that's really changing. This is one kind of key example. And I was thinking maybe we need a new sort of profession, which is, you know, something like an urban designer, but a sort of a highways architect or something. Next slide, please. Possibly the most significant low traffic neighborhood to come forward. This is Oxford Circus. It's really fantastic to see that we're actually going to have some movement here. It's obviously not going to be quite as good as the scheme that we had planned with Westminster a few years ago. But again, COVID seems to have sort of altered the equation somewhat and made things that were controversial and would have been good. Suddenly those things are kind of essential for the future of the city. Next slide, please. This is the Strand, another scheme that's just about to start. In front of Somerset House and King's, and this kind of wonderful church that has been marooned by lanes of traffic for so long is quite soon going to look a bit more like what is on the next slide. So yeah, it is fantastic to see kind of this change right across the city. Next slide, please. As I said, it hasn't all been plain sailing. This was a kind of a recent attack on some planters down in Lambeth. You know, the politics have been tricky, but I think that, you know, if this is your response to, you know, how we deal with, you know, a pandemic and the climate emergency and air pollution crisis, then I think, you know, it's quite clear that you might have lost the argument. Next slide, please. On a more positive note, you know, we've seen a big boom in kind of hyper-local campaigning. You know, as I said at the start, it was, you know, civil society was kind of some of the first people to move in this space back last March. And I think, you know, near where I live, up in Hackney, every single low traffic neighbourhood now has its own kind of dedicated campaign group. So it's really wonderful to kind of see a flourishing of, you know, outpouring of support for this, which is what, you know, we need as the people delivering this to kind of create the political space to make it work. Next slide, please. We've also seen 350 school streets, something that is kind of really taking off as an idea. Next slide, please. And we've also, it was wonderful to see some innovation coming forward in this space. Bikes have been in such high demand that, you can't, not only could you not buy a bike, you also couldn't get your bike booked in for a service. So it's wonderful to see companies like Swap Feets, a kind of a new business model where you don't actually own a bike, you just pay a rental fee each month. So you don't have an upfront cost and you don't have to worry about maintenance, because if you get a puncture, they come and fix it for you. So yeah, as well as kind of innovation on how our streets are used and how they look, we're also kind of seeing innovation in other areas too. Next slide, please. So yeah, we're just looking forward, kind of what's next. Transport for London remains in an extremely kind of precarious position, an organisation very dependent on fares revenue, where fares revenue is still extremely suppressed. It may be a decade before that comes back to how it was. So everything that I just talked about kind of remains a huge priority. We need to kind of keep enabling people to kind of move in different ways. We've got a real opportunity to kind of keep this work pushing forward if we can maintain the funding, and that comes with a whole host of different debates about our relationship with the government, which I will not get into here. Next slide, please. But our kind of focus at the moment really is kind of both consolidating what we've got on street, so upgrading some of those wands to maybe some more permanent bolt down curbs, and also this kind of transition maybe from a low traffic neighborhood with planters to something a bit more permanent. Next slide, please. And you can start to see, in a few boroughs, some of these the schemes that have been working are already going to be made permanent. So that's some of our leading boroughs in Camden and Waltham Forest are already kind of making those decisions. Next slide, please. And as Nina will be able to talk about a bit more, TfL is already looking at the kind of future of some of our street space schemes. One on Tooley Street is, we've got a few out there for consultation at the moment for a transition to a more permanent position. Next slide, please. So yeah, I will finish there. It's kind of a canter through quite an extraordinary year, almost a year and a half. And I'll just kind of end with a few thoughts. Really that this thing about this shift away from streets for movement towards streets for place, it's something we've been talking about for a long time. It's something that has been kind of gathering momentum, but has really kind of accelerated in the last 16 months, and something that Bruce will talk about a lot. And then just a kind of a final reflection on when we think about cities that we're sort of trying to emulate and copy, Copenhagen, Amsterdam, those cities, it took a kind of a crisis to push them into this point. With the oil crisis of the 70s, Copenhagen almost going bust. We have been through one almighty crisis, and this is actually something positive that could really come out of that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Will. And yeah, you commented on the relations with the government. I suppose that actually this is one area where Whitehall and City Hall are in agreement around the topic of active travel. So thank you very much for your thoughts on that. And now we're going to move to the City of London, and Bruce McVean, who is Acting Assistant Director at the corporation, is going to tell us about the plans they have. Thanks.
Thank you, Peter. Hi, everybody. And I guess this follows on from Will's great presentation there about both what we've done in the City of London to respond to COVID-19, so what our kind of street space measures were, but crucially, what are the next steps for those, and how do we manage that transition from temporary to hopefully in due course permanent change. And I think I totally agree with everything Will has said about this being an opportunity for us to really rethink how our streets work, think about how we might move quicker in making those changes, and definitely kind of accelerate the pace of delivery for us. So just a kind of brief overview of what we did as part of our COVID-19 response. This is a picture of Threadneedle Street between the Royal Exchange and the Bank of England. And here you can see, a really good kind of summary of what we've done over the last, well, I suppose over the kind of last half of last year. And that is a reallocation of space, so away from motor vehicles to give more space to people walking, to enable social distancing and make sure everyone is safe as they return to the city, and to provide safe space for cycling. So either, as is the case here, a protected contraflow lane because we've had to make the street one way so that we can reallocate enough space, or in some places just cycle lanes as part of our growing network of cycle routes as well. I guess what you'll also see here is the approach that we took, which is definitely a temporary approach. We thought it was very important to maintain a very high degree of flexibility given the uncertainty around what the return might look like and just the pressure on our streets. But as you'll see shortly, we will be moving towards a higher quality of provision over the next few months there, particularly building out the pavements so that we have a genuinely wider pavement for people to walk on. And then the other thing we did in a few locations, such as Cheapside here, is close streets to through traffic, except for buses or cycles here. Chancery Lane is cycles only. And we also have made some streets access only 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. To provide more space and priority for people walking as well. And the kind of place theme has come through a lot already. And obviously these types of interventions provide the opportunity for us not only to restrict traffic and limit the amount of traffic using streets, but also to carve out additional space for seating and greening as well. And it's great to see how popular this measure on Cheapside is at the moment. And it's not just greening as part of our kind of transport measures. Colleagues in our public realm team have also been rolling out a series of seating areas, so parklets and seating and greening in the carriageway as well. Some of these have involved the reallocation of car parking spaces to provide that, and really done to help support food and beverage outlets, particularly those that didn't have the space for their own outdoor seating as well. And then we have worked very closely with the business improvement districts in the city and the business partnerships that we have as well to support this. And this is Middlesex Street, so the Oldgate Connect bid in partnership with ourselves. And you can see here both the seating and the greening that we've rolled out, the coloured carriageway and kind of really great gateway treatment that the bid have provided. And then just kind of in the distance in the shot, you can see how closing the street has allowed the restaurants along here to provide al fresco dining as well. And I should also say that our licensing colleagues have worked really hard as well to support businesses with more pavement licenses as well. And again, I think this is something that will probably carry over into future years, the kind of seasonal use of streets for more outdoor seating and more kind of life on the street, again, to kind of echo, I suppose, that kind of experience of Copenhagen that has been so well documented before. So all the measures that you've seen so far they're temporary, they're a response to the current pandemic, but they're very much in line with our longer term plans that we had set out anyway. And we absolutely see the provision of really high quality environments, both buildings, but also crucially the spaces between them, as absolutely key to the city's recovery. And if you're interested in finding out more about what we plan to do over the next 5 years to support the city's recovery and help create the most inclusive, innovative and sustainable business centre in the world, then do take a look at our recent report, Square Mile Future City, which sets out there and really highlights the importance, as I said, of kind of making sure that our streets are great places to walk, cycle and spend time as part of our recovery efforts. And a lot of what's in that action plan for recovery is, as I said before, building on our existing plans. So our transport strategy is a few years old now, but I think more relevant than ever. And crucially, I think what we have here is an opportunity to accelerate the delivery of that and really deliver this vision, which has this kind of streets as places right at its heart. The idea that our streets should inspire people and delight, and the experience of both traveling on them, but also just spending time on them is really enjoyable for people and helps give you a great time and day in the city. So where are we now? So just to take you through what's on this map, all the streets that are kind of shaded in grey, peach or green are ones where we thought about making interventions as part of our COVID response. The green are the streets that currently still have some level of intervention on them, and that we are currently reviewing those to see whether it's possible to retain them on an experimental basis in the first instance, because there's still a lot that we need to understand about what the recovery of the city will look like. It'll also allow us to move quicker in terms of keeping them and upgrading them. And we're in the process of looking at those, and hopefully over the next kind of 12 months, we'll have completed that transition. The streets that are in the kind of peachy colour are streets where we had a temporary intervention, where we have taken it out recently. And that's, mainly on, I guess, Cannon Street is a big one there, is just really, from the point of view of how the city works, didn't really make sense to keep that as a one-way street. And then the streets in grey are ones where we either didn't deliver an intervention where we had originally planned one, either because we couldn't deliver enough meaningful change to make it worthwhile, or because things like roadworks in place meant that by the time we were able to make that intervention, it wasn't really justifiable from a social distancing measure. There's also streets in there where we put things out initially, and then in response to feedback and experience of using them, had to take them out again, because they just weren't really working as we'd first envisaged for it. And then I've touched on this already. So I guess as we move into that experimental phase, we want to use stick-on curbs so that we can quickly kind of build the pavements out. This is actually the interim scheme at Bank Junction, part of our Bank on Safety project. And I think we've learned a lot from that, just as others have, about how we can provide quite high quality environments relatively quickly. But crucially, I think if these are experiments, it's important that people experience what it's actually going to be like at the end of that, if it does go ahead, and really kind of get to really enjoy and experience what a permanent scheme might look like, hopefully with fewer bollards. And then this is an artist's impression of Bank Junction. So this is Threadneedle Street, which is the street you saw at the start of the presentation. This is the next stage of our work on Bank Junction, called All Change at Bank, which will further restrict vehicle access into that junction. And crucially, that allows us to create lots of additional public space, more opportunities for seating, greening, and just that kind of life of the city to exist in what is a really kind of key location for us. And you can see here on Threadneedle Street, we've got the opportunity for lots more space, people walking in the area, by far the main way that people travel around the city. We've maintained that cycle access there as well, and opportunities to use planters as well as some trees as part of this as well, to bring more greenery into that as well. So that's going to be completed late 2022, early 2023, and I think is a key part again of us kind of really supporting the city's recovery, but with projects that we had planned and had been working on pre-COVID-19, and have continued to progress at the pace despite having to pick up all this extra work around the response. And then just briefly, we obviously have lots of other projects and programs underway. And Will mentioned the desire for developers to see high quality places, and I think I just wanted to highlight that I think in terms of thinking about streets as places, that kind of collaboration with the development community is really important for us. There's huge change coming in terms of new buildings. Developers totally get this, and I think the opportunities. This is London Wall, to work with those developers to widen pavements, to think about how the street outside their developments changes, but also to change not just the public realm, but use the spaces in the private areas of those buildings to contribute towards creating a great street as well. And then finally, I think, this is something we were looking at before. This is one of our lunchtime streets, which we first delivered in 2019. We're continuing with that. There's actually one today on Cheapside, a bit more modest than they were in 2019. Given the uncertainty, we haven't really been able to plan and resource these in the way that we had, but we thought it was important to keep that program going this year and really kind of scale it up as we move into next year as well. But I guess it's just to kind of highlight this point that not only do we have to kind of make the physical changes to our streets, turn them into great places, I think it's crucially important. And one of the kind of big lessons for us going forward and supporting that recovery is that we need to be much more active in curating those spaces as well. So it's not just about providing the space, it's about providing and really bringing the life into those as well. So thank you very much and look forward to the rest of the presentations and the questions.
Great. Thank you very much, Bruce. And now I'm really pleased to welcome Rachel Aldred, who's Professor of Transport and Director of the University of Westminster Active Travel Academy. Rachel.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you very much, Peter. And I've really enjoyed the event so far. So I look forward to the next presentation and the discussion. So what I've been asked to talk about is some of the research I've been involved in around low traffic neighbourhoods, impacts and distributions in London. And first of all, I'd just like to thank colleagues. So this has been collaborative work with colleagues including Anna Goodman, Anthony Laverty, Jamie Furlong and others. And also to say that so far, most of what I'm sharing has been done without dedicated research funding, hence the fact that we're largely using secondary data sources. So, we're limited by the data available. And as one of the problems in this area is that traditionally data on walking in particular has been very limited. So, we're hoping, watch this space, we're hoping this will change, but so far the data has sometimes been limited. But I'll also say that I am going to go through this reasonably quickly because there's quite a lot of data and limited time, but all of what I'm presenting can be found online. There's papers available and I've included links to those. So please find out more, or feel free to get in touch with me if you want to know more about anything, and I'm very happy to share more information. So low traffic neighbourhoods, as has been mentioned, people at this event are probably reasonably familiar with it. I'll just highlight a couple of things that I think are really important. So these are schemes for areas. They're not just a flagship route, important as that may be. They're about areas, residential areas where people live, which I thought was very interesting because often, pedestrianisation schemes may cover historic city centres, for instance, but often the suburban areas where people live have been left out. So these are potentially very interesting schemes. They can include quite a range of measures that I can't go into, obviously, but basically it's about modal filters that are blocking some modes but not others. So classically, through motor traffic is restricted, but walking and cycling are allowed through. In some cases, high streets can be included as well. So Waltham Forest examples, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, have sometimes included high streets. But basically, it's about removing through motor traffic from a neighbourhood. So the first section of my talk, I want to explain some the research that we've done around Waltham Forest. So Waltham Forest is a really interesting example to look at because it has effectively been implementing low traffic neighbourhoods between 2015 and 2019, well, ongoing really. But we took that opportunity of the fact that there were these low traffic neighbourhoods that had not been called that necessarily, but that basically were these kind of schemes. And the fact that they'd gone in place fairly recently, but they'd also been in for a few years, so there was enough data. We knew when and where they'd gone in, but there was enough data to study them. So just to highlight, what I'm going to talk about is I'm always presenting results compared to control areas, which might be background trends across the whole of Outer London, or might be background trends in Waltham Forest. And this is really crucial, as we know, travel behaviour changes all the time for all kinds of reasons, and at the moment it's changing substantially in different directions due to COVID and changes in COVID restrictions. So having that comparator now is crucial, but it's always been important, and it's important to look at these earlier LTNs as well. So one of the first things we looked at was using a longitudinal study that we've been carrying out across Outer London since 2016. And we found some really impressive results around walking and cycling for these low traffic neighbourhoods in Waltham Forest. So just to say, first of all, the sample size is quite small. Our study was not designed to look at LTN specifically. So the confidence intervals are quite large. You know, we haven't got that much confidence that it's exactly this much more walking and cycling, but there's a very large difference. So I think we can be confident to say there is more walking and cycling. And these effects were much larger in low traffic neighbourhoods than in areas getting other walking or cycling schemes, but no LTNs, and they increased over time. So the first point is Waltham Forest LTNs seem to lead to substantially more walking and cycling, particularly walking. Car ownership, we looked at car ownership using driver and vehicle licensing agency data. And what we found in these low traffic neighbourhoods in Waltham Forest compared to the background trend, the control areas, was that we got a drop of 6% in car ownership after 2 years. And this increased over time. We didn't see it after 1 year, which seems, I think, makes sense. It takes a little bit longer than, say, more walking to show, but it did happen, and it seems to be increasing over time. We've looked at road injuries, which I'll return to in relation to the more recent low traffic neighbourhoods. And in Waltham Forest, we found around a 70% reduction in road injury risk for all modes on roads within the LTNs. We didn't see any negative impact on the LTN boundary roads. We didn't find any statistically significant difference there. So what you're seeing there is the orange line. That's the trend in the rest of Outer London during our study period, going up somewhat. And within the low traffic neighbourhood, we're seeing, by contrast, quite a substantial decline. Street crime is something that people have been discussing in relation to low traffic neighbours. So we were quite interested to look at this. It's not something we'd studied before, but we used crime data from the police, which maps crime spatially, gives you crime points that are quite geographically detailed. And what we found was, compared to the control group, we found a 10% reduction in street crime inside those low traffic neighbourhoods, with larger decreases for violent crime. And we didn't find any displacement. It didn't seem like they just moved a few streets along. It seemed like there was a decline in crime. And one thing I tend to highlight is that the only type of crime that increased showed a statistically significant increase in those LTNs was bicycle theft. And that is obviously not good, but it does back up the suggestion that there's more walking and cycling, because there is potentially more use of bicycles, more bicycles locked on the streets. Finally, in relation to Waltham Forest, we looked at fire response times. So again, a potential disbenefit of LTNs might be around emergency response. There's been some discussion around this. Now, the Fire Brigade publish geographically very detailed data. Now, this is something that we need. This is important to look at to evaluate properly the impact of these schemes. You need geographically detailed data. You can't just look at whole boroughs, for instance. You have to have a level of spatial detail. So we were able to look at the fire response times at quite a small scale, and we were able to show that generally during these years, fire response times were improving, and there was a similar trend in the low traffic neighbourhood areas in the rest of London, in the rest of Waltham Forest. There was no negative impact that we could find in terms of the LTNs having an impact on fire response, and that includes on boundary roads. In fact, boundary roads, things slightly improved relative to the other areas, but again, not a very big difference. So that was reasonably encouraging, but obviously that's just one borough. Obviously there's other things you could potentially look at, particularly if you were able to collect new data. But we also wanted to look not just at Waltham Forest. So the second part of the presentation, I wanted to talk about evidence on these emergency schemes that people have already said something about. So these are really interesting because it's not just one borough, it's across the whole of London. It's obviously in a different context, a very challenging context. And many of these schemes are quite low cost, temporary and so on. They don't necessarily have the additional measures that Waltham Forest were able to put in. They don't have the additional budget that Waltham Forest had access to as part of the Mini Holland programme, which was what these LTNs were originally put in, funded by. So we've started to collect some evidence on these emergency schemes. And first of all, this is just a map showing where they went in between March and September 2020. So one of the challenges we've had is being able to map the schemes, knowing what went in when, knowing what is removed or moved when. So this in itself was quite a big undertaking. So we mapped the schemes that went in for 6 months of 2020. We've now extended that to the end of 2020 recently, but this is a 6-month period, 72 LTNs going in. And this covered 4% 50% of London residents, over 300,000 people. So this is quite, this is a major intervention, really. And in Hackney, this was as high as 1 in 6 people covered by these new LTNs. But, it's very, very patchy. So London has 33 districts, the boroughs and City of London. 21 of them built LTNs. They weren't always called LTNs, but they were things that, had the characteristics I shared at the start. 10 didn't do anything in this period, and 2 built stuff, but pulled them out very, very soon afterwards, in a matter of weeks in some cases. Just to highlight as well that across a range of demographic groups, around 9 in 10 Londoners live on primarily residential streets of the type that might be suitable for an LTN. So potentially this has already covered a lot of people. It could potentially, if it's found to be a good intervention, be put in a lot more places. So I think it's really important that we're able to look at the impacts, which we've started to do. So firstly, we've looked at where LTNs are implemented in terms of a range of demographic characteristics. So because of time limitations, I'm only going to share a little bit of this. So this is in relation to deprivation quartile relative to London. So basically the question here is, have LTNs been put in London's more deprived areas or London's less deprived areas? Is it the leafy streets or is it the more deprived areas? And what you can see in this graph is that people living inside a new LTN or near a new LTN, the pattern is clearly that they're more likely to live in a more deprived area. So LTNs in London have been disproportionately put in more deprived areas. However, when we looked at the borough level, this is quite interesting. This shows what this image shows, and I haven't got time to unfortunately explain it as much as I'd like, but what this image is showing you is that there is substantial variation, that there's boroughs on the top right that have disproportionately put their LTNs during that 6-month period in more deprived and more diverse areas. And there are boroughs that have done the opposite. And there are sort of quite a few that haven't, that have put them in areas that are fairly typical of the borough. So there's quite a lot of variation. And I think it's really important to study this as the programme continues and see if this changes. We've also looked at some of the other outcomes that I just mentioned. So I'm going to just run through those before I finish. So the change in active travel, change in car use. So again, we're using our longitudinal survey data of outer Londoners. So this is just looking at LTNs in outer London. Again, our sample size is small. We've got around 128 people living in LTN areas across a whole sample of around 1,500. But we did find some statistically significant differences. We found that people in emergency LTNs and mini Holland LTNs were more likely to have done active travel. And in emergency LTNs in particular, there was a reduction in car use and a reduction in time spent in the car. So just to summarise, there's more in the paper, it seems like the emergency LTNs are having similar, with uncertainty about the size of the effect, similar impacts to the mini Holland LTNs on active travel and car use. So this provides some reassurance that they're having some similar kind of impact there. We've also looked at road injuries. This paper has just been published. So this is looking at the change between 2018, 2019 and 2020, looking at the change in the LTN areas versus the background trend. And as we know, during COVID, road injuries have gone down because there's been fewer cars on the road, I think. But we've seen a much stronger decline in those LTN areas than the background trend. So injuries halved by comparison to the background trend. What I'd like to highlight as well, though, here is that most of that is due to a very substantial reduction in pedestrian injury risk. I don't have time to discuss this more, but it's really interesting. So around an 85% reduction in pedestrian injuries, and given walking's going up, that's even better than it sounds. So a very substantial reduction in pedestrian injuries within those LTNs. We've also looked at crime. Again, there's a paper published that you can look at for more detail, but we found that crime within those emergency LTNs in 2020 have generally, the crime trends are generally good, particularly in outer London. So there seems to be perhaps, a more positive impact on crime from these LTNs in outer London than in inner London. And similarly, we're seeing a reduction in direct attacks against the person. And as with the injuries, given that walking's going up, the trend is more positive than the absolute numbers suggest. Again, you can read that paper for more details. And finally, on fire response times, so we've also looked at emergency response times in these new pan-London LTNs. And similarly to our previous findings in Waltham Forest, we found that generally there isn't any adverse impact on fire response times. What I would like to highlight that I think is interesting though, is that fire crews reported more delays due to traffic calming measures in LTNs. So there is a perception of increased delay perhaps, but this was entirely offset by a decrease in delays for other reasons. So delays went down overall in LTNs and in other areas. There was no adverse impact of the LTNs on fire delays, but you can see that there might be perceptions that there are because the balance of the way in which reasons for delays were attributed has changed. So I'll just finish there with just, I suppose, thinking about the future. So I think it's really important to look more at this. You know, these are potentially interventions that could be put in place in a whole range of areas. They could cover a lot of people. It's really important, I think, that they're evaluated well. And we found some initially quite encouraging results. But, you know, I think more research is needed. And I hope that we and others will be able to continue researching these schemes. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much indeed, Rachel. It does seem astonishing that there has been such a fuss about LTNs with all the benefits that it brings, and the sort of lies spouted by the pro-car lobby need to be denied by the sort of statistics that you can give us. So thank you very much for that. And now we're going to hear from Nina Patel from Transport for London, where she's a lead sponsor. Nina, over to you.
Thank you very much, Rachel. That was incredibly insightful, and I'll definitely be in touch on some of that information that you had there. So my name's Nina Patel. I am the lead sponsor for the South East area in investment planning delivery at TfL. I've been predominantly a sponsor for cycling schemes for the best part of 6 years now at TfL, and before that I was at Network Rail and a graduate scheme. Can I have the next 2 slides there, please? Thank you. Sorry, I've just introduced myself. Thank you. So I'm going to do a quick whistle-stop tour because I think that others who have presented have done a really good job at presenting on what's been done in the last year and a bit. So as part of the London Street Space Plan, we've delivered, as a number of people have said, nearly over 100 kilometres of cycling routes, 88 low traffic neighbourhoods, some of which were subsequently removed, 322 school streets, and 181 new spaces for pedestrians. We've got some pictures there. The bottom left is the iconic London Bridge. And on the bottom right, we've got Brixton, which I think you've seen a couple of times. The next slide, please. So since then, we've been busy working away at a number of projects. Here's a handful of them. We've got CS8 that will helpfully show you the before of as well. But this is Chelsea Bridge and the upgrade and Tooley Street, which is the bottom left there. Those were delivered earlier this year, and as per the funding, we have delivered them under experiments. The consultation is currently out. On Tooley Street, aided by the London Bridge reduction or removed access to general traffic, Tooley Street has got calmer, and therefore as a result we've been able to provide some light segregation for cyclists in specific locations. But having actually experienced it in the middle of one of our storms, it was quite pleasant to ride. We've also got bus improvements at West End Gate, New Kent Road, and at C38 in Highbury Fields, we've got the first Dutch Star roundabout in North London. Next slide, please. Again, as lots of people have touched on today, we have seen a boom in cycling figures. We are monitoring the network as part of this programme, and we have seen Santander cycle hires reach huge numbers, with 150,000 hires at the the end of Maybank holiday weekend, and on the bank holiday, 53,000 hires. We've seen huge numbers in cycling grow, whilst other modes have seen declines. And this is a lot higher than the average that we've seen, especially at weekends, with one weekend seeing a 68% increase across the 29th to the 30th of May, which is just incredible when you compare it to the other modes that are seeing declines. Next slide, please. So you might recognise this slide because this is actually a slide that was presented a while ago by my colleague Mel. Our challenges really haven't changed. We've still got a pace that we are trying to deliver at, and added to that, we've got a new delivery framework that we're working to, which include new processes. So that's our internal battle that we're trying to have, but we're trying to maintain a pace of delivery of these schemes. We've certainly got financial constraints with limited funding settlements, and therefore, as a result of that, we are carefully considering good value for money and the benefits that need to be achieved. Stakeholder management has always been a challenge for us because London is so vastly ranging in the different types of stakeholders that we need to consider. This ranges from the users, the local residents, the businesses, councillors, and it does really try to encompass everyone, and therefore a decent engagement plan is what we need to consider going forward. And again, balancing the need of the freight network, the bus network, curbside loading, etc., are all factors that we need to consider going forward. They're challenges that we are trying to rise to, but they're constantly at the forefront of our mind that we need to consider. Next slide, please. So as everyone has mentioned, we delivered a number of schemes, including Borough High Street and Brixton, that you can see in temporary measures. And where schemes have the positive benefits for active travel, we are considering how we might progress them into experiments. And this is what we are now considering the future of temporary schemes. Next slide, please. So as part of that, we're doing extensive monitoring. This is monitoring across every single person we're trying to capture everyone that might be impacted. And that is from bus users, bus journey times, general traffic, pedestrians, local businesses, the boroughs, councillors, residents, and that's why we've captured monitoring and engagement as part of that. And in March 2021, we did publish some guidance as to how we might consider, or the boroughs might consider monitoring it, some of these schemes. And those are the themes that we're trying to capture everything in, and that is on our website. As part of that monitoring engagement, we're obviously getting a lot of feedback from what's already out on site. And as part of what we're doing at the moment, we are considering what design changes might need to be considered in order to ensure or at least enable successful experiments. This really does range from a huge, it ranges massively. So we've got things like materials that we would consider, and then we've also got things like junctions, impact at junctions, and some of this work is taking more resources than we'd ever expected, but it's definitely value for money that we consider. And some of these schemes that we're considering are listed there: Park Lane, CS8 upgrade, Hampstead Road, and Cycleway 4 extension, which is Greenwich to Charlton. Can I have the next slide, please? So we're also closely working with all the boroughs. A lot of the delivery programme was funded under the Active Travel funding pot, and most of those are still in place under temporary or experimental traffic orders and pending decisions as per the extensive monitoring and engagement that I mentioned we are doing as well. Alongside this, we're also working with boroughs as part of their 3-year delivery plan to start to think more strategically and longer term or medium term about some of this stuff, because I think it's safe to say that the last 18 months have been very reactive, and all the presentations I've seen today have made me feel a lot better about all the work that everyone has been putting in over the last 18 months, certainly. But we are now heading, trying to figure out what the next step looks like, how we need to get there, and what that looks like. I haven't got another slide, have I? I did want to touch on. No, I just did want to touch on something that Will touched on, which is, we are continuing to develop our cycling programme, not just the London street space element of it, and that includes the original Cycleway 4 and other cycleways that we are continuing to progress as well in more permanent measures that you might be used to seeing as part of what we used to call cycle superhighways.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Nina. Now we've got 3 panelists who are going to comment on what they've heard and to questions. We've got Peter Heath, Design Director at Public Realm Atkins, Rachel O'Donnell, European Director of Strategy and Growth Environment at ACOM, and Stephen Edwards, who's the Interim Chief Executive of Living Street. So, Peter, perhaps I can come to you. So what do you think the role of design is in making streets and public spaces safe and inclusive? And Will Bradley talked about maybe we need a new sort of designer. I mean, I guess you are that sort of designer, aren't you?
Nice to hear you say that before. I just wrote it down as soon as he said it, the profession of highways architect. I am both architect and town planner, but not a highways person, nor a landscape person. But that's what I do as well. The role of the street designer and the placemaker is something that most of my career has gone into under different titles. And there's no doubt about it, there's a great appetite for it. And like many designers, we have a huge range of issues to cover. And I think that's one of the great enjoyments, but also one of the great challenges. It's no doubt about it that, for example, with the Disability Act, which really focused a lot on access to buildings more than places and spaces, we all became woken up to the fact that we needed to deal with the whole range of the communities and their abilities. And to make proper inclusivity means looking at all kinds of aspects. I'm extremely excited by nearly all the presentation material we've heard, because it's one thing that Rachel said is data has always been lacking. Designers who are good thinkers and accept good briefs and look at problems and try and make them overcome have always needed to explain, communicate to a range of audiences complex issues. And sadly, data has always been lacking, particularly, as Rachel said, on the walking side, the pedestrian side. And it's, as you mentioned at the beginning, it's very good that the highway code hierarchy has been changed in legalese language, partially legalese language, to put the pedestrian at the top of the list and to have a duty to protect. And you'll all know there are other duty to protect bits of legislation in progress on other issues. I think that will no doubt help in small and larger ways as time evolves, because as it says, everyone says that Living Streets are best at saying this, always have been. Everyone who uses any kind of vehicle is also a pedestrian at some stage. And of course, those with wheelchair needs are particularly important. Those with eye conditions that limit their abilities are critically important. I suppose I'm always a bit of a kind of devil's advocate, as you know, Peter. The one thing that worries me is an English heritage phrase from long ago: temporary so often drags into being semi-permanent if it's not well designed, but it was cheap to start an experiment. All the things we've heard are talking about quality. And the one thing I would say is there is a new, I hate to call it street cutter, there's a new package of materials which are temporary And of the worst of them, sadly, but understandably, are bits of road sign clutter. I mean, those low traffic neighborhoods have a word called road closed, and then a road for a sign for permitted users, walking, cycling, so on. And then another sign saying pedestrian priority. There are 3 different signs, all different kind of plates bolted on. It's a little bit like when an architect designs a beautiful building but forgets to put all the fire labeling over the fire extinguishers and the signs to exit until the last minute. So I'm extremely positive about the role of designers, and I'm sure my colleagues in Atkins will all feel the same way, who've worked on many of those projects we've seen illustrated from years back. Oxford Circus, the Strand and others have all been looked at over a long period and then delayed, deferred and not budgeted.
Great. Well, thanks, Peter. And now, Rachel, do you think we're good enough at articulating the environmental benefits of the move away from cars and the promotion of active travel?
In a word, no. I think we're still quite a way off fully articulating the environmental benefits of what active travel means, and actually the full benefits of low traffic neighbourhoods. You know, the real benefits to the people who live on those neighbourhoods is having a better place, it's having a safer street, it's having an environment where your children can play out safely, they get more activity in general, you get closer connectivity to nature because you can introduce more green activity in there, so you get better biodiversity, which then impacts on public health. So it's a really a big virtuous circle that I don't think we've articulated well enough in terms of these are the benefits. I think at the moment there's a little bit too much focus on the cycling agenda, which is great, you know, more cycling is brilliant, but it doesn't talk to everybody. And as Nina mentioned, one of the real things here is about the consultation with the people that it's going to impact, and what are those more subtle benefits that will over time really hit home and make them appreciate them. So more to be done, but it's great progress and it's brilliant to see all the things that have been done, and the fact that we haven't just returned back to the car following the sort of the more return to normal. I think that's great progress and something we really do need to be capitalising on.
Thank you very much. And Stephen, it was wonderful to hear all the Rachel's statistics about improvements of LTNs. I mean, how can councils better resource and incentivise low traffic neighbourhoods, do you think?
It's a really big question that gets to the heart of some of the really meaty issues around active travel, around introduction of low traffic neighbourhoods. And at Living Streets, we look at this from 2 sides. Because on the one hand, we are working directly with local authorities to support their consultation and engagement. And then on the other, we're campaigning with local communities to deliver change to make our streets more accessible, safer and kind of better for everyone. When I think about the question, I think there's a few specific things I'd pull out. First of all, there's how we build the positive case for low traffic neighbourhoods. And we've heard from Rachel and from the other great speakers about some of the fantastic benefits of LTNs, whether it's around lowering air pollution, increasing exercise levels, reducing road casualties. And it was particularly good to hear from Rachel about the significant reduction in pedestrian casualties. But it's also about, so, you know, there's that convincing database of facts we can deploy about the benefits of LTNs. But what's really important is how we build that narrative that's more difficult to quantify. It's kind of the place function that Will spoke about. That narrative that paints a picture of creating communities that are safer, cleaner, and more attractive for families to work, play, live in going forward. I think the second point I'd make is around political bravery. And when we look at public opinion, we shouldn't misinterpret the noisy nature of Twitter and Facebook community groups for real opposition. I think there's a really big gap if you look at the public opinion data between real and perceived public opinion. And most people really overestimate the level of opposition for LTNs. And the public opinion research that's out there that we've conducted, that DFT has conducted and others, universally shows consistent public support for measures to increased walking and cycling and for LTNs. So we need to make sure we're capturing that public opinion properly when we're consulting on schemes, and consult in a way that really engages communities rather than just puts kind of questionnaires through letterboxes. And then the third point I'd make is around the reality of how we deliver LTNs in practice and deliver them in the most equitable way possible. The pandemic kind of understandably necessitated the fast introduction of measures. There are much wider issues that we need to think about, from conception through delivery to ongoing enforcement, monitoring and evaluation. And it's vital to carry the community with you throughout this process. So some of the things that we think about on inception: how do you make sure you've got a robust baseline and feasibility studies to really understand the change you're trying to make? Consultation, make sure that's really about proper engagement with local communities. And then with delivery, make sure you're bearing in mind kind of the need for regular and robust enforcement, accompanying investment in behaviour change schemes. But as a couple of speakers have mentioned, make sure the scheme really is fit for everyone. So you're thinking of the needs of kind of the most vulnerable members of our society, and particularly kind of wheelchair users and the partially sighted, and making sure schemes are truly accessible. It's something that was not done as well as it could have been right at the beginning of the pandemic, but I think we're seeing much more progress on going forward.
Great, thank you very much. Now we've got a few questions in the question box, so let's start with one from James Dean. There have been a number of boroughs who have taken out safer neighbourhood schemes and cycle lanes due to car pressure groups. What is the response to coordinate safer active travel right across London, particularly in these boroughs? Perhaps Will, can the mayor be more vocal about coordinating that? And certainly we're hearing a lot from government supporting these as well.
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's a real challenge. The mayor and the TfL are, they're both strategic organisations, and so our role is a coordinating one, as well as having we control about 5% of London streets, but 95% of the boroughs. So without that coordination, we're not going to succeed. You would have seen the mayor's article in the Guardian last week about how the kind of the recent flooding is showing that we kind of, climate change is not something that's happening elsewhere, it is happening here. And in that article he was kind of very clear that low traffic neighborhoods are kind of a key part of our response. So I think he is definitely being kind of vocal in terms of leading there. But ultimately, the way that London's governance is set up, it's very difficult to force boroughs to do that. And we've seen in the past where we, have tried to take that approach, it doesn't work. So ultimately, we have to kind of work together, it's using our powers of persuasion. We do have, we hold some of the purse strings. So, using kind of using funding as a carrot and a stick is one of the tools that we do have. But ultimately, what we do need is the political support from those boroughs. And that is therefore also, coming back to the role of, there's a kind of holy trinity in terms of delivering good schemes. You need really good officers in the boroughs who are willing to do things differently. You need the political will, so you need the politicians who believe in this, and you need the kind of civil society groups, so those campaigning groups. And it's so, what you need to do as residents is to make those politicians know that you want this, because if they're only hearing from the people that don't like it, often those people that don't like it are kind of more incentivized to complain. So we need to make sure that kind of silent majority is always heard.
Thanks. And Rachel, what would you like to see happen? Because you've provided ammunition for people who support LTNs. The government seems to be pretty much supportive too. So what else needs to be done to counter the pro-car lobby?
Thanks, Peter. I'm assuming that's me. It's slightly confusing having two Rachels on the panel. But
yes, I'm sorry. Well, yes.
no, that's fine.
Rachel Aldridge, yes.
Sure. I mean, as I said, I do think more research is needed, and I think people have commented in the question and answer around, particularly around impacts on disabled people and mitigation. I think that's really important, and I would recommend the Pave the Way report by Transport for All, with whom we're hoping to be working soon. And I know Transport for All are also working with some various London boroughs to ensure that problems designing LTNs are avoided. You know, there are examples of things that could just very simply be avoided if thought were given to this, and if disabled people's input were involved. So I would say that is particularly important. I saw some interesting data from a consultation outside of London that suggested that people with mobility impairments were more negative towards the LTNs there, but people with other types of disability were not, compared to non-disabled people. So I think, as Transport for All have pointed out, you know, there are a range of different experiences that need to be considered. So that's really important. Another issue that has been raised in the Q&A was around measuring displacement, potential issues on boundary roads, because of course there's a balance between, well, there's two things going on. There's potentially traffic evaporation, so people change the way they travel, so there's less motor traffic on the roads, but there may also be, at least in the short term, motor traffic increases on the boundary roads of LTN. So we need to study this, and we need to see what happens and see how we can ensure that there's more evaporation and less displacement. And I read an interesting article by Steve Melia recently where he's talking about the way, you know, that there's a tension, because often schemes are made less ambitious because of concerns, but then if schemes are less ambitious, there's less mode shift, there's less transfer to walking cycling, and therefore there's more displacement as opposed to evaporation. So it's very, very interesting. That speaks to the question around resident exemption, I think, because one of the reasons why people were walking, cycling more or driving less in the LTNs that I studied, I think, is that, you know, for people who live there, it was slightly more difficult to get around by car, as well as being better to walk or cycle. So there's these different things going on. Just to finish though on the displacement, this is something that we've set up a method to study. So we do hope to look more at this going forward, to look at congestion. And again, it's really important not just to look at what happens on a boundary road, but to compare that with background trends, because as we know, motor traffic has been going up as we, you know, unfortunately, there are signs of a car-based recovery, and we need, you know, you can't just look at a boundary road and say traffic's going up. That is caused by the LTN or the cycle track. You know, you need to actually look at what's happening more widely, and it may be that the LTN or the cycle track is actually contributing to that boundary road increase being less than it was, but you don't know until you actually study it what it is. Thanks.
Thanks. Now, so a question for Bruce. Why has the City of London already pulled out some excellent cycle track schemes on Queen Street and Cannon Street? And then a question from Lisa Herbert saying, would the City of London Corporation be able to support any more cycling and active travel around green spaces it owns, like Highgate Woods and Golders Hill Park, and others as well, I guess, Epping Forest too?
And yeah, so I guess, as I mentioned in the presentation, Cannon Street is probably the big scheme that we have taken out. I have to say that was always a long shot in terms of being able to retain it. We put it in because under social distancing, we felt that there was a need for a wider pavements on Cannon Street. So I guess first point is it was to widen the pavements, not necessarily to create a cycle lane, but we wanted to maintain the cycle access through there. I think that need is now you know, not necessary in terms of social distancing. I think the other key point though is, I mean, we do still need to allow traffic to move around the city, and in our transport strategy, we're pretty clear on kind of how we would like our streets to what role they should play in that. And Cannon Street is one where we call the city access street, so one that that can be used to move around the city to access different parts of the city, but ideally would not be used for through traffic as well. So, you know, that's one of only two kind of east-west routes we have through the city, London Wall being the other one, that allow people to kind of get through the city and get to other parts of it. So Cannon Street was always going to be a difficult one to retain in the long term. And likewise, Queen Street, actually that needs to go back to a two-way street to allow the changes at Bank to happen. And we thought it was better to kind of revert back to that sooner rather than later, because I mean, personally, I'm wary of kind of lulling people into a false sense of kind of security on things and kind of building up people's expectations and then suddenly kind of ripping away a scheme that we know can't be maintained in the long term for it. So yeah, unfortunately, I don't think they'll be the only ones that don't kind of get retained. But I would hope that we'll be able to keep most of what's on street and improve on what's on street now as we move forward. And yeah, in terms of what we can do around all the green spaces that the City Corporation is responsible for around London. Yeah, I mean, I know that colleagues in our open spaces department do obviously work closely with the boroughs there to look at that. I will say that there's about to be a big restructure at the City of London Corporation, and open spaces will be merging with my department, Department of the Built Environment. And I think that one of the things that will come through that is more collaboration, and I think it will make it easier for those colleagues in open spaces to draw on the expertise in the transport team in terms of responding to consultations and developing their own walking and cycling strategies as well. So yeah, I think there'll probably be more we can do on that over the coming months.
Thank you very much. And we've only got time for one last question. Actually, perhaps Rachel O'Donnell, I could ask you this. It's focused. We focused today on existing urban places, which is all great. But what are the key lessons for new places and neighbourhoods? So, are we planning them properly? Do you think, to create conditions for active travel properly?
I would say no again, actually. I think we are not challenging hard enough on some of the new developments that we've got. We're not looking enough at the green infrastructure and the active travel movement and how we actually embed that into design. I think there's a lot of good work out there, but I don't think enough is being done yet to make it at the forefront of the thinking when it comes to these new spaces. And I also put in the biodiversity around that as well, and how we get the biodiversity pathways in better embedded into new developments.
Great. Okay. Well, there is also a question about any data, either negative, positive impacts on local businesses within LTNs. And perhaps quickly, as we've got a minute or so, I mean, Stephen, perhaps I could ask you. I mean, clearly, pedestrians do bring business, don't they? Whereas shopkeepers often say, if the cars can't park outside my front door, I'm going to lose business. What's your information on that?
We've done some research on this in the past, as has TfL, which shows people routinely shopkeepers routinely overestimate how people get to their store. I think more people drive than actually do. And when you improve the pedestrian environment and the space around retail, it can increase sales and increase footfall in shops quite significantly. So there is a positive business case, and I'd encourage people to go online and look at our pedestrian pound research on our website to find out more detail.
Great, thank you very much. And then there's a question here for everybody from Lisa Herbert. Would the speakers be open to speaking at local community events? Anyone fancy raising their hand? I mean, I guess a lot of you do on a regular basis anyway. So if Lisa wants to get in touch with NLA, we'll circulate your requests to our speakers and see if they are able and willing to attend local events. So well, we've now run out of time, but I'd like to thank our speakers very much for really fascinating coverage of the topic, something which I feel that particularly with some of the comments we've had, much better informed to go back to my local car lobbies and tell them that they're barking up the wrong street. And also just say, in terms of our little competition for light segregation, Councillor Clyde Lokes, who of course been involved very much in delivering LTNs in Waltham Forest, he said that he's very happy to install the winning schemes in Waltham Forest as an experiment. So I look forward to the day when we can put those in, and we'll report back at a future event on that. So we're now up to time, and before we totally say goodbye, there will be, for people attending, the short poll. Be very grateful if you give us some feedback, as it's very helpful for us planning future events. So there's the poll up on the screen. Our panelists can't actually vote on that, but everyone else can. So thank you for doing that, and thank you again to our panelists, and have a good cycle and walk today. Thank you.